Welcome. Welcome to this inspiring opening statement of Hugo Slim. Kuno asked Hugo Slim to reflect on new dilemmas and challenges for the humanitarian sector imposed on us by the Ukraine-Russian war. It was the opening statement of a meeting with directors and senior staff of the members of Kuno in April 2022. Kuno is the platform for humanitarian knowledge exchange in the Netherlands, supported by 14 international NGOs, 7 academic institutes, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all from the Netherlands. And we were happy and proud that Hugo Slim was willing to share his concerns and his reflections on this subject. Before Hugo Slim takes the floor, you will see a very short introduction by Tineke Seelen. Tineke is director of Stichting Vluchteling, the refugee foundation in the Netherlands, and chair of Kuno. She will kick off with a personal reflection on her own lack of patience, which she recognizes also in the newest publication of Hugo Slim, Solverino 21. Enjoy.
Some of you know me quite well even, and you also know my lack of patience. And for sure, you know my lack of understanding of our own bureaucracy, which seems to grow by the year and which is slowing down what should not be slowed down, namely saving lives. Therefore, I was very happy, Hugo, to read in your latest book. I read a few lines and I picked them out of an alinea, so I don't even read them completely. Humanitarians should seek out simplicity. Its current direction of travel is too complicated, too international, too bureaucratic, and too expensive. The new generation of humanitarians now has a choice. They can continue to become the masters of their own complicated bureaucracies, or they can work to a simpler ambition. They can decide that global humanitarian aid is not a utopian project of perfection that should repair, adapt, and reform every part of a person and the society around them. May I please hand you the word, Mr. Hugo Slim, and I hope you can help us to reflect how this crisis in Ukraine now should force us, or could force us, to change for the likely very difficult future we have ahead of our organizations with climate change, conflict, and migration, just to mention some of the challenges. Thank you for being with us. Please.
Tineke, thank you very much. And Peter, thank you very much too for inviting me. It's lovely to see you all, lovely to be in the Netherlands, although of course I'm in Oxfordshire. And thank you, Tineke, for referencing my book. I've started doing product placement in my Zoom calls. So I don't know if you can see behind me, there is Solverino 21. It's like when they put a Rolex on James Bond in the films. It's subtle, but you know, there it is. So I want to talk to you. I mean, Peter said, could I sort of set the scene for your discussion around Ukraine? And of course, I haven't been there, Tineke. I'm far away. I'm speaking to you really as a sort of academic observer now. And so thought I'd try and offer some fundamental thoughts. And someone like Ed and all of you are much more actively involved and operationally involved. So if I can start with some basic thoughts. Peter wanted me to talk about dilemmas, but I avoid that term and think more about some fundamental tests for you as I see them in the Ukraine crisis. How Ukraine will test you in 3 important ways. So I'm going to suggest that it's going to test you politically. I'm going to suggest it will test you hard on localization. And I'm also going to suggest it will test you as internationalists. So I'll come to those 3 things, but first I want to think a bit about the context, because as I see it from Oxford, which is miles away, I can see sort of 6 areas of potential need and operation where your agencies, you know, must be looking in a sense. And of course, the first area, because it's often the most vicious and tragic on our screens, is the contested areas, where the battle and the fight is still in play, and where, you know, in cities like Mariupol, we've seen, and Kharkiv and others, and Kiev earlier, and we will see them all now down the eastern side of Ukraine as well, where the fight is still on and people are caught up in it as civilians, and wounded people are there as well. So that's one area, the contested areas. But then if Russia takes more land and more space over the next few weeks and months, we will also have more occupied areas where there will be needs as well. I think these first two areas, contested areas and occupied areas, are going to be very difficult for you and your agencies to work in. I think the third area is obviously much more straightforward, and those are the government areas where probably most of your agencies are, where the Ukrainian government is still in control, where there's still a good base of services and organization and structure, and where the crisis is really one of millions of IDPs now, but also a degrading national infrastructure, increasing poverty, and a really seriously declining economy. So those government areas will be more easy for you. And of course, where Tineke has just been, the areas of exile, where millions of Ukrainians have fled into diaspora in Poland, Romania, and all the places around, and as they come through Europe, that exile, of course, is also a place where many of your agencies can engage in other countries with Ukrainians. And then fifthly, there is this group, I think, that's very important that we often overlook, which is the military wounded and prisoners of war. I think, you know, it's quite clear there have been more military people killed in this war so far than civilians, and more, probably more military wounded as well. So I think that will continue, and prisoners of war will continue as well. Now, of course, there are some agencies like the ICRC who have, you know, strict mandated operations, but many of you under the Geneva Conventions are also mandated to work with prisoners if that happens. And of course, the final area or groups of people that we have to think hard about are deportees and detainees, because I have no doubt that the Russians will deport people, forcibly transfer people. They probably have already, as we know, and they will continue to do so. And they will detain people as well. So I think we can expect another group of civilians who are deported or detained, or a mixture of the both in sort of internment camps of some kind. So those are the sort of 6 areas where I think, you know, you may be thinking about getting involved as I see them from here. So these 3 places where I think you will be tested, these 3 ways in which I think you will be tested. First of all, I think you will be politically tested. And of course, essentially around the principle of neutrality. So when you look at your humanitarian principles, if you work with them, then I think you can expect to be very politically tested around neutrality. Now, some of this is very normal for you. You're routinely tested by your commitment to neutrality. Today in Ukraine, you have what we might call belligerent donors. You have donors, donor governments, who are seriously one-sided and on one side in this conflict. They may not be parties to the conflict as direct participants in hostilities, as it were, yet, but they are certainly partners to the conflict, and they are partners to Ukraine in this conflict, seeking victory against Russia. So they are working in support of Ukraine while they are also your donors. And as we know, a great deal of this support is full-on military support around arms, weapons, materials, equipment. So it's really partners to conflict, if you like. So Western humanitarian aid, your aid, and you're familiar with this from the war on terror, but your aid organizations are one of three pillars in the struggle for victory of the Ukrainian side: aid, arms, and the economic warfare as well, that is encircling the Russian economy and trying to break it, as it were. So these are the strategies of your government donors, and they're supported probably by a majority of your private donors as well. So your main backers are certainly not neutral. And I think the other thing that's striking about this conflict as well is that the population of Ukraine is almost totally unanimous on one side of this conflict as well. So it's become, as we've seen, a really genuinely nationalist existential struggle for survival. So not only are your main backers, private and public, taking sides in this conflict, so unanimously are the people around you on the ground. Now, this is not so normal for you. Normally, you probably find yourself in a slightly more split fight. So this is more like Myanmar for you. Perhaps Myanmar is the closest today to this kind of unanimous population around you that is not tolerant of neutrality. The third thing I think about neutrality is that even those of you who will try and adopt neutrality and commit to neutrality in this conflict, I think possibly with the exception of the ICRC, possibly they'll be tolerated, and maybe some of the UN. I think most of you will be perceived by Russia as Western agencies and therefore liberal subversives. So of course, this really is a conflict of Russia absolutely going to war to prevent the spread of Western values. So if you approach them as Western agencies, I do not think you can expect to be perceived and seen as neutral by the Russians at all. And I think you will meet a lot of non-recognition and outright refusal from the Russians as Western humanitarian agencies. And finally, I think around neutrality, you'll also be tested, and many of you may have made these decisions already, by your conscience. So I think within your organizations, your organizational conscience, you may have a moral sense that this is not a situation for neutrality. Some of you may decide not to be neutral, and so work for a much wider sense of justice than the principle of humanity alone. And then you will probably adopt what I call resistance humanitarianism or liberationist humanitarianism, in which you take sides and you work in solidarity for a Ukrainian victory because you think that is the way of justice in this struggle. And of course, this resistance humanitarian, liberationist humanitarianism is a very fine humanitarian tradition. We see it way back in the Underground Railway that saved the lives of 100,000 slaves covertly as a resistance movement in the southern states of the US. We see it in international rescue humanitarianism of World War II and against military dictatorships in Argentina and other places. And this resistance humanitarianism often has to be covert, secretive, untransparent. It's incredibly brave and courageous very often. And of course, it doesn't look for government consent from both sides at all. So it may mean that many of you end up working, giving remote support for very brave resistance humanitarians inside contested areas or inside occupied Ukraine if Russians take more land. And you'll be supporting the government itself in those efforts, the Ukrainian government, and resistance NGOs and volunteers and networks that emerge. So to my mind, your first political test will be around neutrality and whether you decide to be neutral or liberationists as humanitarians. And this is a moral choice for many organizations. It's not a choice for the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, who are bound by their constitution to be neutral as well as impartial. But it is a choice for you all, or for most of you. I think the second area you'll be tested is about locally led aid. And I think it's interesting that organizations like Caritas Ukraine and Spes Caritas, the Ukrainian Red Cross, and many, many more voluntary organizations, humanitarian networks that will have spontaneously been set up in the last 60 days, and some of whom will be becoming incredibly effective, some of whom will be under incredible pressure, and some of whom, like all startups, will fail and melt away. This is already, in a sense, the character of humanitarian response in the Ukraine crisis. And international response, as Tineke said, is really playing catch up to a massive government and volunteer effort that is already in place, a nationally and locally led effort. So the international elite system and its super agencies, like the UN, the ICRC, IFRC, and the big INGOs, some of you who represent them, are now raising money and scaling up. And as Tineke said, you've written all your reports, you're getting your money in, you're deciding what you're going to do. So your second real test, in my view, in Ukraine, is to complement, not to crush and colonize locally led aid. In my view, you need to welcome that massive national and locally led effort, the new networks that spring up, the new networks that have probably been evacuating more people out of cities than the ones we see about on the news being negotiated by the ICRC and others. Those are the ones we see on telly. We don't see the wider efforts of local units to get people out. So you need to complement, not colonize, these locally led aid efforts as you get bigger and bigger. And my challenge to you here is that really you need to step back and empower locally led, nationally led government aid, and invest and enable locally led and national government aid, and not compete with it, and so break it up, compromise it, overpower it in the process. And if I'm honest, I worry that the international aid system will fail this test. I think many of the agencies will be driven by their own institutional interests for money, profile, power, and jobs. And I fear you and some of your international NGO, UN, International Red Cross colleagues, ICRC colleagues, you may ruin the national response of Ukraine by becoming domineering and predatory, looking for projects, looking for space, looking for staff, and so conflicting the humanitarian response. And if I'm to be facetious, I think you may slowly engineer an occupation of your own in the humanitarian sector. So you must not let this happen. You must pass this test. You must ensure and enable the humanitarian system of Ukraine as a key part of their freedom. And don't bring in lots of expats, bureaucracy, and systems. Complement the Ukrainian efforts. Don't colonize the Ukrainian humanitarian efforts. And the third test is, in my view, the challenge that we've all been challenged with already, of proving that you are still an internationalist as an organization, that you're an internationalist organization. How can you maintain a morally balanced international portfolio when Ukraine is such a big crisis and such a European crisis, and so central to your government donors? And in a sense, we haven't seen this since the 90s, when we saw the Bosnian, former Yugoslavian war, which was exactly the same discussion. Everyone's driving trucks of fish and chips to Bosnia. Everyone's arriving there. The whole governments are obsessed about it and can't see Africa anymore, but there are wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda at the same time. So now that we have a major war in Europe, again, how can you maintain that balanced portfolio so you can prove your truly an internationalist organization? And how can you balance as well war in Ukraine and other wars against climate emergency, which is going to be equally demanding in the next few years? So finding some level of operational equity around the world must be important for international agencies like you, who are concerned with universal values, global humanity, global impartiality, looking at all humans and all human needs. So I think this is the third test, to show you can stay involved and productive in Yemen, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mali, Myanmar, and Ukraine. And Ukraine, your response to Ukraine should be a proportionate response for you and in this wider portfolio you hold. And I also think that if locally and nationally led aid is really strong in Ukraine, and some of their structures and networks hold and can be resourced and operate well, Ukraine could be a smaller response for you and a more hands-off response for you than some of these other ones. But we also know that Ukraine will last for years. So you've got to find that balance in your portfolio with other universal crises, if you like. So those are the three tests I would just give you. I hope they're useful. The political test around neutrality or not, the localization test around enabling Ukrainian systems or colonizing them, and the international test about finding some balance of universal equity in your current portfolio in which Ukraine can sit ethically. Thank you.